review and scoring process for our community investment round for affordable housing projects, and also our youth violence grants as well for prevention and intervention. So that's sort of happening right now, just to sort of update. We do have, I think, a couple of new staff members on, and one of the things I think we've been asked to do is when we have new staff members to just share it, so council members know who we have on our team and that we are getting staffed up in areas, which is very exciting. So if it's okay, we'll just take a moment to introduce some new staff members, both in our homelessness division and in our community engagement division. So Emma, you go first.
Great. Thanks, Jessica. All right, everyone, I'd like to introduce you to Odie Anaya. She's our new homeless outreach supervisor. So she's going to be working to create an outreach team within the city that will be able to just better work with our needs. And so the next couple months, she'll be creating the program, and then hopefully bringing on a team of 2 outreach folks as well in the next couple months. So look out for that. We'll be having more people coming on soon. And Odie, if you want to say hi.
Hi, super excited to be here and get to know everyone and start working on creating this program.
Thank you. And then Joseph?
Yes, good morning, council members. Happy Thursday. Good to see you. I'm very excited. We have Andrea Wright that has joined the Youth Violence Prevention Program. She is our Youth Violence Prevention Program coordinator. So she is going to be our person in the field, if you will. She's going to work really closely with our school districts, with our community partners, hosting our events that we have throughout spring, summer, all of that good stuff. And she is coming from APS, so she's very plugged in with our school community already. And I think she is going to be a wonderful addition. So I'm excited for you all to get to meet her and get to know her a little bit more. She's exactly what our program needs, I think, and will be a great addition. Jessica did mention one of the other announcements that I had really quick. I just wanted to let you all know that we are in the process of reviewing our NOFO grants. We did have 35 applications this round, which is fantastic. We had more prevention applications than intervention this year, which I'm very excited to see. So we are in the process of the review panel with that. They're working feverishly to get through all of those, lots of reading. But next month we will have those recommendations moving forward for you all. But I just wanted to give you a little bit more detail surrounding that. So thank you.
I think that's it. Thank you.
Absolutely. Thanks for the introduction. All right, then I guess we'll go to the next agenda item, which is an update on the housing strategy.
Good morning, council members. Good morning, Horns Committee. My name is Alicia Montoya. I am the Housing and Community Development Manager on Housing and Community Services, the Housing and Community Services Department, for the record. And I am providing an update on our housing strategy and just the work that we're doing in regards to our housing needs assessments, and specifically the assessment that we are doing with DRA, or David Paul Rosen and Associates. If you can move to the second slide, that would be great. So specifically for the housing strategy is that we're doing this effort. Our housing strategy was adopted on December of 2020. And through the housing strategy, we adopted 12 goals to implement. Part of those goals is to create revenue or financial resources to bring and create more housing units in the city of Aurora. We had specifically identified a deficit of about 7,500 units at the time. We are anywhere between 7,500 and 8,500 right now because of the pandemic and just the continuous growth of population in the city. So very important for us to create these housing units in the city. One of the things that we do to get creative in regards to doing the housing assessment study was applied for the grant 1271 through DOLA. And we are utilizing that fund by hiring DRA. We did have to do a 25% match, but all in all, the goal is to come up with innovative housing strategies to create affordable housing in the city. And so I am going to pass it on to Nora and David Rosen from DRA. They are going to be providing updates on the housing housing needs assessment and the things that we're looking at or considering in regards to creating revenue for affordable housing purposes.
Good morning. Let's see. Can you hear me? Good morning, council members and Horns Committee members. If we could skip to slide 3, please. Next one. As Alicia mentioned, DRA was retained by the city to conduct a scope that we developed in consultation with city staff. It included a brief update on housing needs, market conditions, and the affordability of market rate housing in Aurora, a more detailed economic look at the cost to develop new housing in Aurora, and comparing that with the rents and sales prices that low and moderate income households can afford to pay, a review of how the city has been using its existing housing revenues to produce or preserve affordable housing in Aurora, an examination of ongoing and new leverage sources of financing from the state of Colorado and other sources that can be used to make Aurora's financial resources go further. And as Alicia said, a main focus on looking at and evaluating potential new local funding sources and regulatory approaches to increasing affordable housing production in the city. So today we're going to give a very brief update on affordable housing need and economics, on the city's current production capacity with its existing resources, on potential new resources to increase affordable housing production in Aurora, and other recommendations that we're working on. So the housing affordability gap analysis compares the cost of developing market rate housing with affordable rents and sales prices in Aurora. The gap represents the value of incentives or subsidies that are required to make different types of housing affordable to Aurora households. And just a brief summary of findings, there are gaps for home ownership in Aurora, starting at 100% of area median income, which is about $112,000 for a family of 4, and below for single family detached and single family attached homes, and 80% of area median income and below for townhome and stacked flat condominiums. On the rental housing side, there are gaps for market rate rental at about 80% of AMI, which is $89,000 for a family of 4, for apartments developed with surface parking, and because of the higher cost, the gap started 100% AMI and below for structured parking. So the market will not produce housing for Aurora households below these income levels without assistance due to the cost of developing housing in Aurora. Next slide, please. As Alicia mentioned, your housing strategy in 2020 found a need for 7,500 rental units for households earning less than $25,000 per year. HUD-CHAS data also shows that there are 12,000 renter households at 50% of AMI and below. That's approximately $58,000 for a family of 4 that pay more than 50% of their income on rent. And those are considered severely cost burdened by HUD. So there's certainly a need for affordable housing in the community. Next slide, please. Aurora has been very successful in leveraging its limited existing financial resources to maximize the production of affordable rental units. The greatest leverage is provided for affordable rental housing, serving households from 30% to 80% of area median income through the use of low-income housing tax credits and tax-exempt bonds. Next slide, please. This slide shows the number of financing sources that are typically required to make a new rental tax credit and 4% low-income housing, private activity bond and 4% tax credit project feasible. And you can see here, there's several different projects with and without state credits, which are another leverage source, which helped close the gap. for family housing in the first two columns, and then the third column is for permanent supportive housing, which due to the lower income targeting and higher service requirements has even greater subsidy needs. So Aurora has been successful in leveraging its funds so that its city subsidy in these projects ranges from $9,000 to $13,000 for the tax credit family units and about $28,000 for permanent supportive housing units. And with the additional small amount of general fund revenues and $3 million in ARPA funds over the last several years, that has enabled Aurora to assist a pipeline of about 1,900 units over the 2021 to 2023 3-year period. There is another 1,000 units in the pipeline, including projects that have not received all the funding that they need. And again, this has been partially enabled by the influx of ARPA funds in the past several years. Next slide, please. In terms of going forward and the city's production capacity with its existing resource, the city gets about 1.1 million of home funds each year, which at a $15,000 average subsidy assists about 70 tax credits, or can assist about 70 tax credit units per year. The city also gets the private activity bond cap. This year will be 23.5 million, and that will assist about 150 tax credit units per year at $150,000 per year average bond amount. In addition, in terms of a one-time resource that the city has, there are 3 sites considered very suitable for low-income rental housing, comprising 10.43 acres altogether, which could accommodate about 626 multifamily rental units at a 60 unit per acre density. Next slide, please. We talked about the leverage financing sources. There's in addition to the private activity bonds that the city gets, CHAFA has additional bond cap. It's very competitive. Though Aurora projects have been successful in receiving allocations from CHAFA as well as from the city. There's the state tax credit I mentioned that helps provide that subsidy to fill the gap. That was extended in 2018 for 5 more years through 2024 at $30 million per year. That will end after 2024 unless extended further. The Colorado Department of Housing has home funds and other sources of subsidy, and recent Aurora projects have been successful in receiving an average of about $20,000 per unit from those sources. And then the statewide affordable housing fund created by Initiative 108 will provide approximately $270 million in revenue for affordable housing for the state in FY 2023-24, and that can be used to assist rental housing up to 60% of area median income and owner housing up to 100% of area median income. That source is quite flexible, can be used for land banking, equity investments, concessionary debt, and affordable home ownership. May help the city with affordable home ownership and preservation of existing rental units, as well as new rental construction. And it does require the city to commit to increasing affordable housing units by 3% per year. Next slide, please. Currently, we are examining another of revenue sources and techniques that the city could employ to increase its affordable housing production over those levels allowed by its existing resources. And the sources that we're currently evaluating include an incentive zoning ordinance, which provides voluntary incentives for affordable units that developers provide, inclusionary housing, which requires developers to build affordable units or to provide other satisfactory alternative compliance options. Fee waivers, as you know, water and sewer tap fees are high in Aurora and beneficial to provide waivers for those fees, but they do require a source of revenue in order to repay the fees or to pay the fees to the water and sewer jurisdictions. We're looking at residential and non-residential linkage fees. These are development impact fees that are levied on residential or non-residential development based on a nexus analysis that examines the cost of providing affordable housing for lower income employees that are generated the demand of which is generated by new residential and non-residential development. And then there are a range of funding sources the city could use that require voter approval. Some techniques commonly used for affordable housing are real estate transfer tax, generally at 1% of the transfer value, an excise tax on construction materials, a dedicated sales tax, a portion of which will be dedicated to affordable housing, and a dedicated property tax. So over the next month, next slide, please, we'll be completing our evaluation of these potential sources. And here's a table that shows kind of our initial assessment of the different strategies that I just went over. We'll be completing our evaluation of these and coming up with our recommendations for those that we think best fit in Aurora. And we'll be including projecting the potential revenue production or the potential housing production from each of these potential sources or techniques. We look forward to coming back to you after we complete our analysis within the next month to discuss our recommendations with you. Next slide, please. Other recommendations that we are developing as well relate to the preservation of existing rental housing. There are a number of particularly tax credit projects, both acquisition rehab and new construction rental projects that are coming upon their 30 years, the end of the 30-year compliance period. And if in for-profit ownership may be at risk to conversion to market rate. So that's something the city should look at. The acquisition of owner housing. The city has done partnerships with Elevation Community Land Trust for acquisition of single family homes. And we think that's something that's worth considering looking at continuing that partnership. Entitlement and permit processing, reducing those times, making them more predictable would help both market rate and affordable housing deals. Some cities also offer fast track processing for affordable housing projects. Internal and external accessory dwelling units can provide small increment in terms of development of new housing units in the community, and some communities have income restrictions for those to make them affordable, so that's a possibility. We'll be looking at the unrelated parties rule and how that affects housing. Term of affordability, we want to make sure that the city gets the maximum term of affordability when it puts in subsidy into affordable housing projects. Similarly, we recommend ground leasing of city-owned sites for rental development to provide the city the maximum control and over those projects or over those sites for the long term. Construction defects regulation, which has certainly had been a barrier to the construction of new condominium units, and then a property tax exemption for affordable housing. So that's kind of the update of where we are in our study, and we look forward to working with the city to complete it.
Thank you for the presentation. Alicia, did you want to add something?
Nora, if you could go over that, I'm sorry, just that chart where we had all of the different options that we're looking at. I just want to make sure that our council members know what are all of the different options that we're considering. And I think you were starting to get into that with the recommendations in general, but I just want to make sure that they see that chart with all of the different things we're considering.
Can we go back to that slide then? I think it was, I don't know. It's
the slide is really hard to read in this detail. So I think that the charts, Nora, you just went over kind of summarize all of that. And then when we come back, we'll certainly provide this chart along with, more of the detail. But this is pretty hard to read. But I think maybe just an overview of the different things you're looking at with each of them, kind of that column all the way on the left, might be helpful to just review, and then we can come back with the detail.
Okay, yeah. So I listed all of the kind of sources and techniques that we're looking at, from incentive zoning through the voter approved initiatives. So we're looking at the stakeholders that are affected from each of these. the advantages and disadvantages to the city of the different techniques, alternative compliance options when there are different ways to satisfy, such as for inclusionary housing, it could be land dedication or offsite construction rather than on-site construction of units. For nexus impact fees, it could be the provision of units rather than the payment of fees. There are a number of other communities across the country that use these various techniques. And we've listed here, and we'll go over with you again, the kind of typical range of requirements and assessments, and we'll complete our projections of the annual production potential for Aurora for each of the sources that we are able to.
Thank you, Nora. And then, yeah, we're available for any questions that you may have on the presentation.
Can I just add super quickly, and just in terms of next steps, obviously there's state legislation currently happening around affordable housing. Some of the things that we're looking at in this study are either directly related or sort of tangentially related to that legislation. And so our timeline for this project has been interrupted a little bit based on what's happening at the state level. So as Nora's and team are finishing recommendations, we're also tracking what's happening obviously at the state. And so our recommendation would be that we wait for that to play out at the state before we would bring anything to study session, would be the recommendation of staff. So probably looking at not going to study session probably until June, just based on the timeline. So just wanted to offer that suggestion.
I think that makes sense. I wouldn't have an objection to bringing it to study session then. Will you still bring it next month to Horns though?
You want us to bring back the same, or you mean just like the final recommendations?
Yeah.
I think that kind of depends on timing for when we hear back on legislature and when that's finalized. My understanding is there's about 30 some changes that are being made. And so we can bring it back to Horns before we go to study session again, or before we go to study session. I just want to make sure that I am clear that we're kind of on the clock with legislature and figuring out what that timing is going to look like. But I think the request is for us to bring it back to Horns once we have the final before it goes to study session. Is that correct?
Yeah, and I got confused with you saying that we're on the clock. But so I'm hearing we're on the clock, but also we're waiting for the end of ledge session. So I'm a little confused now.
Yeah, that's really it. We just want to make sure that legislature is done, or like that process is complete before we bring the final recommendations to Horns or study session. So
Okay.
disregard the clock comment.
That's okay. I wanted to make sure we were on the same page. Yeah, that would be my ask. Councilmember Marcano, are you okay with that?
Yeah, I think that makes sense.
Thank you.
Thank you. Any questions in regards to the presentation or any of the information presented?
Alicia, this is David Rosen. Can you hear me?
Yes.
If I can add a comment for members of council and staff following Nora's presentation, and maybe to assist in framing questions, both in terms of the data and analysis we have in hand to date on this study for you, and the remaining pieces of work. So Aurora has done a good job of leveraging, in particular, state resources for its affordable housing production. But as you've seen from the presentation, there is a yawning gap, even with doing a very good job of leveraging outside resources and the remaining unmet need in the city. So I think one way to think about these policy options before you, none of which are easy, but having been asked to focus on new revenue and new land use regulations, which have the capacity to significantly increase production of affordable units in the context of the very large need in the community, would be to really understand quantitatively, and our work will make this clear for you in your policymaking, how far you can go with state resources in particular, whether it's the Housing Trust Fund or CHAFA or the Colorado Department of Housing funds. You've done a good job of leveraging, and you can perhaps expect to continue to do so. One area where Aurora has really suffered in state resources, it's really a federal program, but it's administered by CHAFA, is the higher value low-income housing tax credit, the so-called 9% credit. Aurora has failed to achieve awards of any such 9% credits in, I think it's been the last 5+ years. And that's largely because the allocation formulas for that competitive program disadvantage your city. So before turning to your own difficult policy choices of new revenue sources and new land use regulations, which the city itself can adopt, one additional outside leverage source that I think deserves focus and attention is the 9% low-income housing tax credit program. With that said, I think the production estimates, given the affordability gap analysis, the cost of development in Aurora for housing products today for both owners and renters, and the income levels that the market is currently serving and those income levels below which the market is not serving, what your new production capacity could be from each program. And one of the exhibits that Nora has prepared begins to provide estimates for that. So I think as you think about these policy choices ahead of you coming into the June study session, I think it's worth weighing the number of units that could be produced under each option and the impacts on various stakeholders in the community to help you guide your decision making. So hopefully that provides more of a meta context or framework for your policy making and your questions. Thank you.
Thank you, David.
Councilmember Marcano, do you have any questions?
Yeah, so looking at the housing affordability slide here, it says that market rate owner housing is produced at cost affordable to folks at 100% of the AMI, and then lists $112,000 for a family of 4. I want to know where these figures came from, because that's not the median income in Denver for a family of 4. About 10% lower than Denver.
Well, these are from the HUD income limits for the Aurora, Denver, Aurora, Lakewood MSA.
Okay, because even that was giving me a lower figure. The average income I did find was around like 111K, but the median is a lower figure. And I'm wondering if it's just like differences in sources and whatnot. Because that's one of the things that I think I've expressed frustration about in the past, that we use the MSA figures for this, but we're on the lower end of that. So what we consider 100% AMI using that is actually not accurate for our residents.
Right. Councilmember, are you referring to the average or median income levels in the city of Aurora?
Yes.
Yeah, that is a frustration for jurisdictions like Aurora, which are situated in larger MSAs. And for better or worse, and this is important for, again, your policymaking considerations for your income targeting of your own revenue sources and land use regulations. So you're asking a sophisticated and important question. So if incomes in Aurora are lower than incomes in the MSA, then the figures that Nora summarized for you are based on the MSA numbers. And those are the numbers that govern all of the leverage programs we've been talking about, whether it's the home program, the tax credit program, the private activity bond program, the state housing trust fund program. They're all governed by MSA median income numbers. You really don't have control over that regulation. But to the extent that you generate your own revenue locally and or you impose land use rules, such as inclusionary housing, on development within your city, you are able to further calibrate those numbers down to better focus on the needs. So I think you're very right to focus on that differentiation. And I think the other thing to really keep in mind here is where the market is producing units that are affordable, both in the owner and the renter frameworks, and how far below that you want to be to target your scarce and very dear local resources to serve those most in need and not necessarily served by the private market unassisted. Does that help?
I think it does, but at least the broader explanation and the understanding that these measurements are by and large out of our control. But what I'm interested in doing is tailoring some of this to our reality, right? Like our median income, the latest census survey, is $72,000 for a family of four, and this is saying 100% AMI is 112,000, right? So
Yeah,
there's a massive gap there, and that gives me great concern because, like, if we're not utilizing good data, it's what was that saying? Garbage in, garbage out. So, we're not going to be able to actually help folks. I mean, what we're saying, 80% of AMI is for Aurora is actually, almost $20,000, $15,000 less than that. So.
Yes,
right. Again, when you
for
say
the tax
median,
credit program,
median,
I'm sorry, for the tax credit program and those types of things, the rents and incomes are driven off of the MSA data, and the actual median household income for Denver, Aurora, Lakewood was 117,800 in 2022. But when you look at the income limits for very low income and low income, they don't track percentage-wise exactly. So that's where you come up with about 111,000 for a moderate income household, again, based on the MSA data for a four-person household. So there are some, differences in how, whether you go straight off the median income or go off the HUD income limits. And like you say, these are for the MSA and not for Aurora. But when you are looking at the tax credit program and state funding programs, they are going to be based on the MSA.
Then that circles back into this basically disadvantaging Aurora, which was a comment that was made earlier. So.
Correct.
Yeah, I think the way to address that, the way to address that concern. I'm sorry, excuse me. Sorry to interrupt. I don't have videos. So I'm a little disadvantaged. Yeah, can you still hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
So again, I think this is a very real concern that you're highlighting, and the mechanism that you can use to more deeply target beyond the rules used by CHAFA and DOH and HUD and the IRS, is when you contribute either land or cash subsidy to the transaction. And then it's kind of like the concept in elementary school math where you use the lowest common denominator. So if in the capital stack of, let's say, affordable rental projects, you're contributing land, whether it's Colfax or some of these other priority sites that are city-owned that we've identified with staff's leadership, or you create a local housing trust fund or another source of revenue, then you can impose lower limits, and you're still gaining the leverage of bonds and tax credits and state housing trust fund money, but you're more deeply targeting the income. If you're not contributing anything to the development in the form of land or money, then, and money could be fee waivers. It's conceivable that you could condition a fee waiver, which is a capital subsidy if you think about it, right, with these more deeply targeted income rules. But when I made my initial comment about conceptualizing whether and how you pursue new revenue and new land use policies, as Alicia commented in her opening remarks, I think a good way to focus your tough decision-making here is on what you're buying with that capital and that land, right? And what you may be buying is deeper targeting to address the concern you've stated. Does that make sense, or does that help?
Yeah, it does. Thank you.
Any other questions, Councilmember Marcano?
Nope, I just appreciate the work that's put into this, and I'm excited to see, actual recommendations. I know some of these, was mentioned earlier, the state's looking at, like the unrelated parties. Some of these we're already doing, so I'm just hoping we're able to do more of them and more aggressively.
Yeah. Thank you for your questions, and thank you for the back and forth and for the presentation. I don't have any additional questions, but I'm looking forward to reviewing it once this is finalized and before it goes to study session. I'm excited to see we're making some tangible movements forward. So,
Sorry, I do have one more question.
Go for it.
And let's go into construction defects reform on here. So this is something that we have heard for years. I know the state legislature addressed to some extent in the past. So I want to dig into this a bit, because a lot of what I've seen recommended in terms of construction defects reform are basically neuter consumer protections for folks that purchase properties that are shoddily built. So can we discuss that point a little further here? Because I see you have it labeled as a high impact recommendation.
Yeah, we see it as a high impact because it would have, quite a significant effect, I believe, on new condominium construction, stack flat condominium types, and those are tend to be less costly to build and so more naturally affordable. So, in terms of what the legislative fix is, I don't know that we are in a position to determine what the best fix is, but so I think we
if you don't have specific kind of suggestions, I'm not sure why you would list it here, because this to me is something, like I said, my background's in architecture, engineering, and construction, by the way. So I've heard this complaint a lot, and I know that there were changes made to make it harder to kind of have mass litigation efforts, basically, for very minor things that could be very easily fixed. And that made sense to me. But this canard keeps coming up, but no one ever actually suggests an actual, tangible thing. They just keep saying, oh, construction defects. That's why we don't have condos. While it's,
Councilmember Marcano.
Yes, go ahead.
Sorry, I was like, I wonder if I could jump in.
Yeah.
I was just going to say, I think Councilmember Marcano brings up an important point. I just feel like, at least on this and perhaps other recommendations, you're making the recommendation that is a very contentious conversation, right? And to Councilmember Marcano's point, I think that makes it important to talk about, but I think we will hit a wall in this, okay, but what is the right, I hear arguments that, it slows down, or it doesn't allow, the risk doesn't allow for condos to be built. And I hear that. And I think I'm open to, what might look better. And on the other side, concerns around consumer protection, right? And I know I don't want to advance policy forward that dips into, the concerns around consumer protection. We've heard some horror stories around that, right? And we don't long-term want to put people in a terrible position just to expedite the development of condos. But I wonder if it's in the scope of your contract or areas of expertise to maybe contemplate, maybe if it's not specifically detailing or outlining the policy, but some areas where like the specific points of contention and some, I don't know, maybe aggregating what other or states have done, other best practices, or more pro and con to each approach. Like I feel like that's gonna advance the conversation in a more productive and useful way. Which is why I'm glad we're bringing this back to Horns, because we might be able to offer some thoughts on like navigating the conversation, because this isn't the first time we've battled specifically on construction defects laws, and I want to support affordable housing, but I think it's helpful to know where we'll get stalled out, frankly.
Yeah.
May I comment? Can you still hear me?
Yes, we can. Go ahead.
So we've worked with both the state and City and County of Denver over the years, perhaps over the decades in Colorado. And as I think all of you are well aware, this is a very old and very contentious and still unresolved issue in the state. I think at a high level, we possibly could help highlight the policy trade-offs between litigation protection and consumer protection, and there are going to be trade-offs there. I certainly don't represent, and DRA does not engage in engineering assessments such as the councilman's expertise, architecture, construction, engineering. So I don't think, for better or worse, in our current engagement, and even given our firm's expertise, we're the folks to chapter and verse provide guidance on building code and the intersection of building codes and litigation. If I could contrast the litigation question with the 9% low-income housing tax credit question that I mentioned in my comments earlier, that is an area of state policy where I think Aurora can be quite specific in standing up and saying, hey, we have been disadvantaged over years in the state's administration of the 9% program. We've received nothing under that program. It's the single most valuable subsidy source for very low-income rental, and we need some reform here. And that is an area where, Nora, I think we could look at the Qualified Allocation Plan, or the QAP, which is the regulation that CHAPA uses to allocate 9% credits, and perhaps identify specific changes, Council Member, in that state policy, which would result in a material change in your access to leverage. Perhaps frustrating for you and your question, I don't think we can offer specific building code / engineering standards guidance on resolution of the state litigation problem in condo construction.
I appreciate that, because I mean, I know most jurisdictions in Colorado, they just adopt the International Building Code. So, from in my experience in the field, if you follow code, you follow the spec book for a project, you have standard warranties.
Yeah. Yeah.
So it's like, I feel like some of the things that I've heard from folks is that they want ways to be able to cut corners legally that benefit them and not the future owners. So that's why I'm looking for specifics, but I do appreciate that. And yes, I'm happy to explore any avenues to lobby the state or the feds. We have the ability to do that with regards to getting 9% LIHTC into the city, because it's absolutely needed, to your point.
I think on the 9% LIHTC issue, it's really a state matter. The federal rules basically provide the states the leeway to adopt the regulation that determines allocation and competitive criteria. So CHAPA and/or ultimately the state legislature and governor is where you probably want to focus those efforts.
Okay, appreciate that.
And I'll make sure that we have it, or that we add it for discussion with Liz Rogers as well. I just looked through the list and I don't think she's on our call, but I'll make sure that we have that conversation with her also.
That'd be very helpful, and I'd love to be involved in that. Thank you.
Mhm.
Well,
Great.
one thing I'd want to emphasize is even after maximizing your leverage of other people's money, this light tech, 9% light tech question, for example, the city will still fall very far short, as I'm sure you appreciate, of meeting your needs. So I think the maximization of outside leveraged resources is very helpful support for the policy decisions facing the council with regard to local new revenue and local new land use regulations that are within your authority to adopt.
Thank you, David. Great. So if there aren't any other questions from here, then the plan is to bring this back once we have the final recommendations, hopefully by our next Horn study session, and that will put us in time to bringing it to this committee before we bring it to study session in June.
That sounds like the plan.
Okay, great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Nora. Thank you, David. Thank you, everybody, for your questions and inquiries on our presentation.
Thank you. Very good to be with you this morning.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
All right. Any updates from community members? Not seeing or hearing any. We'll assume that's a no. One thing before we adjourn, just want to make sure that we have a time for agenda setting. Jessica, I don't remember where we left off. I know we had a standing meeting and I don't know what happened to it.
I will double check with our admin staff and make sure we have one before the next meeting. We do have several items for next month, so we'll make sure that we have a time to connect in the next week or so.
All right, sounds good. All right, we are adjourned. Thank you so much. We'll see you next month.
Thanks, y'all.